University and Research in the Netherlands, and I'll be moderating today's event. So as the title suggests, today we'll be discussing UNFCCC transparency arrangements and how they work out in domestic context, and we'll try to bring together sort of academic perspectives as well as practitioner perspectives from in-country. So just a brief background, UNFCCC transparency is basically about a reporting and review system where countries have to submit reports, and those are then also undergoing review. And in this event, we're also particularly interested in how that works out in a domestic context, what benefits and burdens linked to that. And we have two internationally leading research projects at the table here, TRANSGOV and TRANSCLIM. And we'll be getting presentations from them, as well as domestic experts from India and South Africa. So we'll proceed as follows. I'll go to the next slide to quickly go through the agenda. So we'll have to be confirmed opening remarks by someone from the Secretariat, but the plenary is ongoing as well at this time. So we'll have to see, we might have to delay that to later in the session. Then we'll have two presentations by Professor Aarti Gupta and Professor Harro van Asselt. We'll then continue to a panel discussion, and we'll also then have some closing remarks. So we'll now go to the first segment. We'll skip the opening remarks for now from the Secretariat, and we'll have two speakers. The first speaker is Professor Aarti Gupta. Aarti is principal investigator of the TRANSGOV project. She's a professor of global environmental governance with the Environmental Policy Group at Wageningen University and Research. Her research is in the field of environmental and climate governance with a focus on transparency and accountability. She has published extensively in these fields, including a book, Transparency in Global Environmental Governance, Critical Perspectives. And she's also a member of the Scientific Steering Committee of the International Earth System Governance Research Alliance. So I will now give the floor to Aarti for her presentation. And you're welcome to use the speaker location there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Max. Is this on? Is this working? Okay. And do I have a clicker? Okay, maybe I Okay, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. We know there are many, many competing events, competing for your attention and time. So we're very grateful you're here. And as Mark said, I will present just a little bit of setting the stage from the perspective of a research project, TRANSGOV, which is actually transforming climate governance through transparency. And let me see, yeah. This is a 5-year research project. We're about halfway through. As we know, the 2015 Paris Agreement calls for an enhanced transparency framework. And the aim is to make visible country climate actions. And there are many, many assumptions and hopes and promises that are pinned on this enhanced transparency framework. And those assumptions and hopes turn on the fact that transparency is a vital element in enhancing accountability, state-to-state accountability in the global context, but also enhancing mutual trust, and thereby facilitating enhanced climate action. So these are the assumptions for some of the benefits that transparency can help realize in the global context. But there are also many, many promises and hopes associated with transparency in the domestic context, that it will help underpin domestic climate policy choices and priorities. It will help access finance for critical areas of climate action. It might help in participating in markets. But the point of departure for the TRANSGOV project is are these promises and are these assumptions actually being realized in practice? And surprisingly, there's very little empirical analysis of what are the effects actually in practice of all of the engagement in the UNFCCC transparency arrangements. And this becomes a very important research gap to fill, and that's what the TRANSGOV project is interested in. Also because, as we know, the enhanced transparency framework is due to start to be implemented in 2024. So this is a vital moment to examine what can we actually learn from engagement thus far in pre-Paris transparency arrangements, so that we can learn some lessons for the effects of transparency going forward. And this is also vital because if you look at any of the events or any of the policy framing around transparency, you'll see in the gray literature, in the UNFCCC context, that transparency is described as the backbone of the Paris Agreement. So in what sense is it the backbone and what are its effects? So that's our point of departure, and I have about 6.5 minutes or so left. So I wanted to give just a little flavor of how the TRANSGOV project is trying to address these questions about the effects of transparency, both globally and domestically, through in some sort of systematic way. So we have a number of research themes. We start with trying to get a picture of what has been the nature of the engagement in transparency arrangements. So how have countries actually engaged in the pre-Paris ICA, IAR arrangements, for those of you familiar with that alphabet soup. So how has that gone so far, and have countries submitted reports, etc.? So that's our first, just setting the stage, what has been the nature of engagement. After that, we were also interested in getting a big picture sense of what is the ecosystem around, globally, around capacity building for transparency to help countries report and participate in reviews. So an overview of the global capacity building for transparency ecosystem, where does it focus, what are its implications for benefits, and etc. And then finally, the third theme is the overall question, the core question of the effects. What is transparency? Once you're engaging and once there's capacity building to facilitate engagement, what kind of effects are being realized actually, domestically and globally? And domestically, we are looking at doing case studies of countries, basically of India, South Africa, also the Netherlands, and we are very happy to have today also participants from South Africa and India to participate in our panel discussion. And we also have other specific foci within TRANSGOV. We're looking particularly at climate finance transparency as well, and 2 new members have joined looking at adaptation finance as well as private disclosure. So that's what our focus is. I want to give you just a very quick flavor of what some of our findings have been around the first 2 big picture questions of engagement and capacity building. So for the first, we tried to develop, and this is together with the other transparency project that exists out there in the research world, Harro's, we collaborated on this with Romain Weitmans. We produced a transparency adherence index just to see how countries are adhering to these pre-Paris obligations. And just one important observation coming out of there, there's a lot in that paper, it's open access, everyone can look into that if you're interested. But one observation we had there was that you could have 100% adherence to the reporting obligations, but there's not necessarily a correlation there with the extent of climate action that a country might be engaging in. So that's just to throw out there this maybe surprising, maybe not surprising finding. And then on the capacity building front, we find that we looked at the political effects of the kind of focus of capacity. There's a whole ecosystem of capacity building for transparency. There's the CBIT, there's the ICAT, there are other initiatives. And what we find there is that there's a lot of focus within capacity building in a general sense to prioritize building domestic capacity for greenhouse gas inventories and for mitigation actions. Now, of course, those are the mandatory transparency obligations, so it makes a lot of sense. That's logical in one sense. But what we wanted to do was in TRANSGOV, we want to actually use that as a point of departure and take a step back when we think about that next question of effects, especially domestically and especially in developing countries, for example. We want to actually examine, we want to not take the transparency obligations as a given and as a starting point, as a point of departure, because that's what the gray literature and the mainstream view is, that, okay, these are the transparency obligations, now how can countries adhere to these, and what are the data challenges, what are the institutional challenges, etc. But we want to take a step back and ask the question, why are some things, some elements mandatory, why are some voluntary, and to examine sort of the political contestations that underpin the transparency obligations, both pre-Paris and the enhanced transparency framework. So to ask the question whose priorities are reflected in this, and this is not to reopen contested negotiations about these matters, but just to highlight that these questions about priorities are very fundamental to the overall question that we're all interested in, which is what are the benefits to be realized in domestic context, and those are, of course, to be are going to be linked to priorities that countries might have, and whether those priorities can be realized through reporting and review. So with that, the overarching question we also have as a point of departure is looking at the enhanced transparency framework and the obligations, is to ask the question, who is actually to be transparent about what here? And we see in a general sense that the politically negotiated and somewhat narrow focus of the enhanced transparency framework, even though its provisions are expanding, is of course on mitigation and on greenhouse gas inventories. That's generally been a priority of the Paris Agreement, and that the question is, where does adaptation, finance-related transparency, loss and damage, etc. fit? And a proposition we want to explore then is that the burden of such enhanced transparency might come to rest on developing countries, especially those with very low emissions. But in general, our point of departure is to suggest that rather than a neutral means of implementation, transparency is actually sort of a site where larger political contestations get hammered out. This is, of course, a political space, the UNFCCC, and politics is not a dirty word. So why would transparency be exempt from those political conflicts? So we want to start with that point of departure because we want to then look through that lens at the question of both benefits and burdens in a domestic context. So with that, I'm almost done, Mats, in case you're getting nervous. But so I want to link that to the question of this particular session, domestic burdens and benefits in developing countries, to highlight that, well, now with the enhanced transparency framework coming, we see post-Paris in the MPGs, the modalities, guidelines, principles, that there are ever more specific and ever more detailed requirements around the mitigation-related transparency. We have elaborate common reporting formats, tables which run into pages, but the other issues remain complex. It's very difficult to know how to report on and review issues related to adaptation needs, loss and damage, etc. So I think I will end with the question that we don't need to ask ourselves only, well, what will transparency deliver, but to ask what kind of transparency will generate what kinds of benefits and for whom. And that, especially in the domestic context for developing countries, how does this link up then to envisage domestic benefits which are related to underpinning domestic climate actions, which types of climate actions, and where do the priorities that developing countries might have fit there? What about accessing finance for what type of climate action and participating in markets, etc. So with that, we are very much looking forward to collaborating with others. And this is our TRANSGOV team. 5 of them are present in the room today, so that's quite an achievement. So please feel free to reach out to us, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aarti. And now we'll give the floor to Professor Harro van Asselt. Allow me to also quickly introduce you. Harro is the principal investigator of the TRANSCLIM project, which is another of the 2 transparency research projects. He currently holds the Hutton Professorship in Climate Law at the University of Cambridge, and he's also Professor of Climate Law and Policy at the University of Eastern Finland Law School. And he's an affiliated researcher with the Stockholm Environment Institute. He's also editor-in-chief of the Review of European Comparative and International Environmental Law. I now give the floor to Harro for his presentation.
All right. Thank you, Max, for this kind introduction, and thanks, Aarti, for setting the stage very well for the further discussion. I'm also going to go through some of the research that we've been doing as part of another project, in which I guess we can call the little sister project of TRANSGOV, the TRANSCLIM project, which is a project that I've been leading together with Anton Jigme at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, as well as Romain Wiekmans, who is now with the Free University in Brussels. Like Aarti and like the TRANSGOV project, also in our project, we are interested in the effects of transparency arrangements, multilateral transparency arrangements, but also specifically how these effects are brought about. And that's what I'll talk about during this presentation. So Aarti already mentioned, right, like a lot of people see transparency as a key backbone of the Paris Agreement. And indeed, many people indeed talk about transparency also in the context of the overall ambition mechanism, the ratcheting mechanism of the Paris Agreement. And indeed, as this figure from the New Climate Institute also indicates, transparency is key to provide insights in how countries are implementing and achieving their NDCs, but also overall to keep track of progress towards the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. But also, as Aarti already noted, a lot of the work that has been going on is very much work about, well, what are the rules, what are the obligations for states in terms of their reporting, in terms of their review, and also how can we make sure that states and parties actually comply with these rules, for example, through capacity building. And we have like a number of initiatives, maybe some of them are in the room or online, specifically focused on that. But also, like Aarti, I very much suggest that to appreciate the proper contribution of the Enhanced Transparency Framework and its potential contribution, we need to better understand the effects of reporting and review. We also need to understand how these effects are coming about. Now, as probably everyone knows, on reporting and review, there's three components or three stages, if you may, that have already been in place since the Cancun agreements for the UNFCCC, and we also see this now under the Paris Agreement. So first, we have reporting by states, either through greenhouse gas emissions inventories or through the upcoming biannual transparency reports. And states are reporting on all kinds of information, greenhouse gas emissions, climate finance provided for developed countries, climate finance needed for developing countries, progress towards the NDCs, and so forth. And these reports are then reviewed by technical experts in terms of their transparency, accuracy, completeness, comparability, and consistency. And ultimately, in the last stage of the process, there will be more multilateral peer review, more a Q&A session among parties, if you may. That's let's say, the beginning part. But then the end part, there's also all these benefits or expectations that are put upon the transparency framework. And there's a recent report by the Secretariat that actually lists some of these benefits quite clearly. And I would distinguish the benefits and the effects in procedural ones and substantive ones. So on the one hand, it might help in building trust. It might help with raising awareness and overall knowledge. It might help with getting stakeholder buy-in, maybe from companies and businesses in your country. But from a substantive perspective, there's also the expectation that it might lead to greater ambition. This is also mentioned in the Secretariat report. Improved policy making, better reporting over time, access to climate finance and carbon markets, which Aarti already talked about, and maybe ultimately enhanced international cooperation as well. And we also know that in the middle, there's all kinds of actors that are involved in this, and the focus very often is on national governments, right? Like the government officials writing the reports, or the technical experts that are engaging with government officials in the technical expert reviews, or the delegations here that are asking questions from each other in the multilateral process. But there are also other actors involved, and not only the governments themselves, there are other parties who are involved. We have non-state actors, civil society, businesses that are involved, but also parliamentarians, auditors, all kinds of domestic actors that can be involved in moving from, on the one hand, these components to ultimately the effects and hopefully the benefits. But what we say, or at least we take, is that actually there's a lot we don't know about how these processes work. So there's a bit of a black box of what actually happens in practice. And here also echoing the call of more empirical work is we actually need to talk more about with in-country experts of how these processes work in practice. Now what we did in our project is sketch a broad, more theoretical and analytical framework of what are the possible pathways through which these transparency arrangements can ultimately lead to certain effects and changes in state behavior. I'm not going to go through the whole slides, also for the interest of time, but I will at least highlight briefly each of the pathways. So the first, what we call evaluation, is basically a process of self-learning. So government officials learning about gaps in implementation to ultimately improve on their policy making. The second is also a process of learning, but then rather than within a government, it's between states. So it might be a sharing of best practices between governments, where the information disclosed by one government might be helpful for another government. Then moving on to the reassurance pathway, or as we call it, reassurance, it might be that the information provided or the process itself actually provides some reassurance to another country that another party is living up to its obligations or doing its fair share. Then if we go to incentives, this is more the carrots and sticks idea, is that on the one hand, information might try and point out that a country is actually not complying with its obligations and might also ultimately lead to a certain punishment, or conversely, it might lead to certain rewards if the information actually shows that a country is doing a good job. Then shaming and faming, or naming and shaming and naming and faming, is again a very familiar pathway which focuses on the information that is provided, which then allows a non-state actor, for example, or other parties to either tarnish the reputation or enhance the reputation through that information. And lastly, socialization. It's more a long-term or longer-lasting pathway where the accumulation of information over time helps countries to learn and reframe certain concepts and ideas. So thanks for bearing with me through this relatively academic slide. But then, of course, you might be interested, well, how does this work out in the context of climate transparency? And here, I think at least some of the pathways might be discernible in the context of climate transparency. But as I also said, we need more work on the ground in practice in different countries to test some of these pathways. But if you look at some of the reports that are out there, you can at least see some evidence for it. So again, the Secretariat report that I already mentioned, you can see that, for example, in the case of Uganda, the inventory reporting helped the country of Uganda improve the underlying basis for its NDC target, and maybe even also expand its NDC targets to other sectors. So here we see a very clear evidence of a country learning from its own reporting to improve its NDC. Another example, which actually comes from an article that Aarti and others have co-authored, is that through the facilitative sharing of views, there have been practices, or there have been questions about what are the best practices in biannual update reporting. So again, giving an idea that yes, this type of learning can take place. Reassurance might also happen in practice. For example, if a country provides very reliable data on their greenhouse gas emissions or the adaptation needs and adaptation barriers, which might again lead to increased climate finance, as also the Secretariat report highlighted. And then the other pathways are actually more difficult to find out in practice, but maybe one more hypothetical example could be that the reports and the information generated through the reports submitted by countries might in the future be used in certain climate change court cases, focusing on strengthening ambition and strengthening implementation. Now, if there's one message that I want to convey towards the very end, is that while there's a lot of focus, and understandably so, on national governments, there are also a number of other actors that can, and I would say also must, play a role in making the transparency framework under the Paris Agreement work. And I think it's important to keep in mind what kind of information these actors may or may not use, but also what type of information these actors may and may not need. And here, again, do we need to report for reporting's sake, or do we want to think about what is actually what is most likely to bring about certain effects, such as improved policy making? So I end with a few questions, but I think, given that I'm probably running out of time, I'll just leave them on the slide, and we go to the next set of speakers. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Harro, for this presentation. And indeed, we'll go into the next session, which is a panel discussion where we can also take some of these questions on board. So I would now kindly ask the panelists to come on stage, and maybe Harro, if you could sit here and bring your nameplate, then we leave the spots for the panelists on that side of the stage. Also, while everyone is getting seated, Jigme from the Secretariat asked to sort of convey his apologies. He's stuck in the negotiations going on at this time, so he won't be able to do the opening remarks. But we'll now turn to the panel discussion, where, like Harro mentioned, we need to hear more about what's actually going on in the countries from people who have experience with that. And we have 4 panelists who can comment on this. So the structure of this session will be as followed. I'll pose the first discussion question, then I'll give each of the panelists about 3 minutes to provide comments on this question. We go around the table, and after that there's also time for the audience to pose questions, if any. So let me quickly introduce the panelists. So first, Sumit Prasad. Sumit leads the international cooperation team at CEEW, a public policy think tank based in New Delhi. He's done various studies on transparency-related items, including on pre-2020 climate actions, but also looking forward to 2030 commitments. He's also authored the MRV chapter in India's biannual update report, and he was nominated by the government of India to the UNFCCC roster of experts. So we're very happy to have Sumit here. We also have in the panel, so joining us online, Dr. Himangana Gupta. She's a research fellow and academic associate at the United Nations University Institute for Advanced Study of Sustainability. She was also part of the National Communication Cell at the Indian Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change from 2016 to 2019. She contributed to India's 2nd and 3rd biannual update report to the UNFCCC. Then we also have Dr. Tapelo Letete joining us. He's Director Climate Change at Sutari. So he also has expertise and experience in the greenhouse gas inventories and carbon accounting, impact and vulnerability assessment. He is also included in the UNFCCC roster of experts and a greenhouse gas inventory lead reviewer. He also used to be with the department in South Africa. And then allow me to also introduce Reitumetse Molotsoane. She's head environment at the National Business Initiative in South Africa. She was formerly a director of mitigation response analysis at the South African National Department for Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, where she led the analysis of and reporting of national mitigation actions, including to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. She's also nominated to the UNFCCC roster of experts for South Africa. So I'm very, very happy to have this panel here on stage and joining virtually. So I'll now turn to the first question we'll be discussing, which is, so we heard about do these benefits ban out in the national context, so that's why I wanted to ask, what incentives drive participation in these UNFCCC transparency arrangements, particularly for developing countries, and also based on your experiences, have these anticipated benefits materialized in practice during past engagement with the UNFCCC transparency arrangements? So I will first give the floor to Himangana, joining us online, to give your comments.
Thank you, Max. Good to see all of you again. But what a pity that I cannot see the audience transparently. Yeah, I'm hearing my sound back, sorry.
Just to confirm, we can hear and see you.
Thank you so much, Professor Aarti and Professor Harro, to set the context. Very good to see already that you put one thing in your presentations, that transparency is not something that is new. It was actually a part of the convention through the national communications. It is something that the developing countries have already had an experience with. But of course, the new enhanced transparency framework comes with a B and B, which I mean benefits and burdens. So where there are benefits, I think the incentivization of the benefits will happen on its own. But where it is a burden, it has to be incentivized. So in all of these negotiations I've been hearing about capacity and finance, it's a real need of the developing countries, no doubt in that. But how do you get the data for transparency is another issue. Yes. Sorry, just writing something to the technical team. Yeah. So to implement GHG-related transparency arrangements and also the progress indicators for NDCs, we need both finance and also capacity. And for that, we need good quality data. And for that, we need to integrate it at the legal frameworks of our parties. So I think the GEF Finance has already incentivized that. I was working for a UNDP GEF GUI project for around 3.5 years. And I think it was the GEF funding that actually incentivized the preparation of the biennial update reports and national communications for India. And however, I see that in the enhanced transparency framework, this remains, like mitigation and NDC remains a shall requirement, but something which is very, very important for the developing countries is a should requirement, and that is adaptation. So of course, we need to set up systems for our inventory management system, for our inventory management. That will of course be strengthened in the future. Many developing countries are coming up with the national inventory management systems. India hasn't, but maybe in future it may. But still, we do not have enough data for local level vulnerabilities. We need more disaggregated data for our key category sectors. But then, is transparency just about showing the data? It is also about enhancing confidence and trust among the parties. So transparency shows the finance flows, it shows the capacities developed, and it could also show the adaptation efforts made in the future. So we know how this is important. This is important for global stocktake as well. Because this time, the global stocktake, of course, it's happening at a great level. The decisions are being made, the negotiations are ongoing. But if you see for the adaptation, no quantification can be made because there is no real data available for adaptation efforts. So if you really want that, I think transparency is something that can push for vulnerability assessments through adaptation communications, and BTR is going to play an important role in that. So the finance is still ongoing. In India, we have the 4th National Communications Project from the GEF. I think that is one finance that is needed, but we also need to think that we cannot continue these things in a project mode. So obviously, we need to institutionalize these systems at a national level and then bring in experts who are good in inventory management, who can make country-specific emission factors and have long-term MOUs with them to strengthen the transparency at the national level. I have seen that at national level, even being a part of the ministry, it is sometimes very difficult to get the data even for industries because it affects their competitiveness. So to solve these kinds of problems, there needs to be more legal arrangements, as I mentioned initially. So yes, I think I would like to end with that not just that we should always be provided incentives, but through those incentives, we need to institutionalize so as to make the system more effective and sustainable. Yes, thank you for this question. Yes.
Thank you so much for this intervention, Himangana. And on this final note, also on the role of institutionalizing in the industry, I would now like to pass the floor to Reitumetse to tell something about how this plays out in your view and in South Africa as well.
So thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity. And I suppose for this particular session, just focusing a little bit more on what is happening in the business space in South Africa, and really how that then links up with something that is occurring at a much more macro level. I think South Africa and the business community in particular have historically done quite well in this framing around sustainability and reporting around that. And, you know, the NBI in particular, where I'm located at the moment, has had a long history through that type of initiative, through the CDP in particular, so the Carbon Disclosure Project. So we have traveled quite a journey in terms of indicating within a business space the importance of being, again, it's transparent. It's how are you showing up as a business, how are you showing up relative to your peers, but also how are you showing up when we're looking at your investors. So that has provided really an excellent base, I think, for progressive maturation that you're seeing in the business space. So as new things come on board that are related more to, for example, climate-related financial disclosures and so forth, that maturation has been something quite progressive that we've seen over the years. Then I think perhaps coming from the other side, and obviously ultimately it links to how South Africa is able to report and show up on the international stage. So in parallel with what we've seen on a voluntary basis, I think is also quite key from the business community. Clearly, the legislative, the regulatory environment in South Africa has also been maturing quite fast to interface from a top-down perspective with what business has also been doing and is better prepared to fit into some of those systems. And I think perhaps my colleague will reflect a little bit more from some of his experiences, how that has worked. But it's been very much one of these, one of the important drivers is we've acknowledged from the business perspective that the regulatory environment is maturing, and it's maturing in response to some of what is coming out at the international level. So obviously the reporting that's going into the UNFCCC. And that has been a big driver of being ready, using some of the existing platforms like a CDP, but other forms of sustainability reporting in particular, in preparation for a more rigorous and a more structured regulatory environment and reporting requirements going forward. So that has always been something that has been quite visible. I think there's a good degree of engagement between government and various business organizations. I do think, though, that there's more opportunity, just noting how even at an international level, the reporting requirements are becoming a little bit more stringent. There is more of an opportunity to leverage the degree of maturity that we're seeing in the business space that's brought about both by the voluntary reporting platforms and more as we've implemented some of these national regulations as well to increase the degree of connectedness between what business is doing, how they've integrated the understanding of climate change into their businesses, but also making provision for that kind of reporting in their own systems, in their management systems, how they're handling and managing data and building the expertise within companies to be able to respond to that area. So I do think, in our case, a very clear connection between, at a company level, but obviously driven by some of the investor interest, a connection to that, what is happening at a national level, and that has been always very clearly linked to how we report and how we show up internationally as a country, leveraging all of these different information streams and the degree of maturity that we've been seeing in that space. And we will, hope to continue that sort of a process and an approach going forward.
Thank you very much. And it's very interesting, like Harro already mentioned, all the different actors that are engaged here as well, including also the business sector, as you mentioned. Sticking around in South African context as well, I would like to pass the floor on to Tapelo. And you've also been actively engaged, including with the DFFE on reporting, and now at Sutari. So what are your views on the benefits and burdens of participating in these systems?
Yeah, thank you very much. What is interesting is that as South Africa particularly, we have never seen reporting as burdensome. In fact, we are pro-reporting. We have been pro-reporting for a long time. I think the key realization of the need for evidence-based climate response has always been there within South Africa, that we need evidence to support action in South Africa. And because we do not have legislation, and we have been pushing this legislation for quite a long time in South Africa. So for us as a country, the involvement in UNFCCC has been critical in ensuring that the domestic MRV systems are built, because it has become the basis upon which we are now building the MRV systems that we are having to say we are putting together a GHG inventory system because we have a commitment under UNFCCC. Because otherwise, if you go to the likes of your big industries and you say, we are here to collect data, they say, for what? Under which legislation? What are you trying to do? What will you do with it? How am I going to get in trouble with it? Without that basis of legislation, there have been, as a country, the primary basis upon which the systems have been based is really the participation in UNFCCC. Otherwise, using some legislation, I think Reitumetse has said, what you've tried to do is leverage on some of the existing National Environmental Management Acts, but that are not really geared up for climate change specifically, and therefore you sort of try to poke on different elements. But the existing legislation will only allow you to go so far. So for us, that is really the biggest benefit, that it has allowed us to actually do annual GHG inventories. In fact, I said we are pro-reporting. We do annual GHG inventories. No developing country is required to do an annual GHG inventory. We do internal expert review of GHG inventories in South Africa. We are not required to do that. We even, we even go into bilateral inventory platforms and peer-to-peer exchanges with the likes of Canada, with the likes of the US, and so on. That's because of that. And we have also an annual climate change report because we have realized that need. But I think the second benefit that you definitely get is that when you do get into the UNFCCC platform or reporting, and you are therefore required to do that reporting frequently, you actually get much better at it. You get much better. And a study, I did a study where I looked at MRV systems of about 11 countries, and I realized that one of the key reasons, while resource is one area, while developed countries have been so good at, for instance, GHG inventories now, is simply because we ask them to do it every year. And the more you do it, even if you don't like, you'll get better at it, however way. So for us, that's what we are trying to simply do, simply emulate to say, why is developed countries getting better? Well, it's resources. Well, we know we can get resources from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What else? It's because their reporting frequency is high. Well, let's do that as well. And therefore, we do that under the UNFCCC, but also separately. Let me maybe leave it here with you, Max.
Thank you so much, Tapelo, for that intervention. And a very good point about, I know South Africa has submitted a lot of reports and gone beyond the requirements in many of these ways. So it's very interesting to hear about those perspectives as well. And I think in the discussion question we can talk more about that. But before that, I want to give the floor to Sumit Prasad also to comment on these matters also from a non-state actor perspective and what your views are on the benefits and burdens and in general the purpose of the transparency arrangements.
Thanks, Max. Hi. Greetings, everyone. I'm Sumit, and I work with the Council on Energy and on Water. So, we are talking about transparency. So, the very first question that comes to my mind, how does a party consider this transparency? Whether they consider this as an obligation or whether they consider this as an opportunity to learn more about their climate action. So, this is something, the very first thing think about it, and then we can talk about whether it becomes a benefit or whether it becomes a burden for them, right? The moment we think it as an obligation to do it, that moment we start thinking it as a burden, right? Because then it's just an exercise which is, which needs to be done for the sake of doing it to the submissions to the UNFCCC, right? But then if it is for the purpose of, getting benefits out of it, right, or to learn more about or exploring opportunities, then what would be the purpose of the transparency? Yeah, to me, there are 4 key purposes of the transparency. One is to understand climate actions that they are implementing, right? So definitely what I've seen from my experiences across in India as well as in a few other countries which I've been sort of, working with, what I felt that, countries do learn when, when they sort of monitor their climate action, they do try to understand that, what's the real progress happening on those particular front. And the second part is, based upon that, when they start reporting on this climate action, they also try to understand what is the challenges that they face in that particular process, and what is that they need it to be able to implement it better, whether it is capacity building, whether it is finance, whether it's technology. So this is the another benefit that comes out of it if we take it as an opportunity. And the third part is at the end of the day, when we sort of collectively look into the entire actions, it helps us to understand where is our progress as a country, and then leading to the global stocktake process that will help us understand collectively where we are at a global level. So these are the some of the things when we look at it, the transparency benefits. But to me, the most important point is setting accountability. Yeah, what's the outcome of the transparency, right? How do we take it forward? Now we know where we are in terms of our actions. We know what are the gaps are, and we know where what our current status is. We are very far away. Even from CEEW perspective, we have also published a paper. We have made use of all the developed countries' emissions trajectories which they submit annually, and we've realized that developed countries are not on track. But then, how are we setting those accountabilities at an international forum? How do we take it forward? Is the transparency really leading to enhancing of ambitions? Is the transparency really leading to bridging the financial gap? I think that is where it's something which is the key to be addressed right now. In terms of the information, when we talk about the BUR and the BR process that were there in the existing transparency realm, I feel that process was sufficient enough to be able to understand where we are going in that direction. But when we talk about enhanced transparency framework, which is comprising of complex Excel sheets, which now the developing countries are also supposed to report on, I think there is a space for the discussion to think, what do we want to achieve by reporting these Excel sheets? Do we want to report better so that we are, we are better equipped to give critical inputs to the science, right? Or do we want to sort of, make sure that we do very critical analysis of our efforts domestically? And then how are we aligning those information with our domestic climate actions, right? I think these are some of the questions that there is a huge space for us to deliberate upon, because if you look at it at the present stage, right, developing countries are at different standpoints with respect to their capacities to be able to report on climate action. I think there are like hardly 10 countries have submitted their BUR4, and it's almost it's almost coming to the end of it. Now we have to report on BTR. So how do we sort of think about even approaching to BTR to that extent, right? So I think there is space for the discussion to happen on that note. To what extent the BTR guidelines could be sort of adhered by the developing countries. I know that there are capacity building initiatives for transparency, but to what extent all the developing countries would be able to sort of accommodate that? Do we need to put that much amount of effort for each and every country? These are the questions, and that I think should be discussed more. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention, Sumit. And I already see some very interesting threads coming up here. That on the one hand, we heard Tapelo saying like having these obligations is a big opportunity because that otherwise you wouldn't be able to do this. But on the other hand, if you follow obligations for the sake of obligations, it might actually also turn into a burden. So there's those different lines. And then also the question of how much detail do we really need to further those goals that we're all looking for. Just putting that out there. But now I would like to also give the chance to the audience to pose any follow-up questions based on these discussions. If there are any, also virtual participants can pose questions in the chat if they want to. But first checking if there's any follow-up question from the audience here in the room to the panel. Yes.
Thank you. Great panel. My name is Markus Lederer, Technical University Darmstadt. A question to the two research projects and whether you have any hypothesis and any knowledge of the mechanisms which might be behind opening up this black box of transparency, as Harro has nicely pointed out. And that is regarding not so democratic countries. Now we have here two democratic countries, and we have seen that they have used this as opportunities. But what about not so democratic countries where probably the government is a much more important actor and civil society has much less of a role? Does transparency make a difference? And if so, is it procedural or substantive? Any ideas? Thanks.
Thank you for that question. If there's any other question, we could collect them. And All right, then I'll give Harro quickly the chance to respond.
So I
Yeah.
think that is aimed at me. Yep. Thank you for the question, Marcus. So I'm not going to come up with hypotheses on the spot, but clearly the role of non-state actors in more autocratic countries will be very different because there might not be a parliament, there might not be an active civil society. So in these countries, I think it will be more important to focus on the pathways that work through government officials. Right? So in that sense, I do think that some of the pathways that we again theoretically outline, self-learning or like the evaluation pathway, but also learning from other countries, I do think that can still take place. So maybe there's a need to focus on that rather than, let's say, domestic mobilization. You might also imagine that these countries might be more immune to naming and shaming and other reputational mechanisms. So, and I think maybe just to also point out what I was trying to say earlier, is that these pathways, I would not expect them to play out in every country in the same way. It's more like the suite of ways in which transparency arrangements can have an influence, but it's up to us as researchers to try and find out which one works in which countries and which one works best and most effectively in which countries.
Maybe can I?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that question was more to Harro, but maybe I'll just add one observation that in certain situations it might also be easier in certain authoritarian or autocratic situations to actually get the data you need, say, from the private sector. So it's a more streamlined process of, you just mandate it and it happens. So it's a sort of messy process of also there's very large stakeholder engagement and consultation, say in South Africa, for example, around all of these reports. And so you dispense, in some sense, with a number of domestic considerations. So you could see a more sort of streamlined, efficient process, and which is geared towards complying with global obligations. But of course, as Harro was saying, the dynamics are very different, and you're missing the civil society element, which can also use that reported information to hold accountable, both domestically, globally, etc., which is what you see in other instances, perhaps. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Then we'll move on to, then I'll pose the next question for the panelists. And then we'll do another round so that everybody can respond. So the question is then also looking a little bit forward. So what lessons can we then draw from existing experiences with this existing process of reporting biannual update reports for the transition to this enhanced transparency framework that will become operational from next year onward? And you're also free to link back to the comments made by the other panelists here. And I'll again start with Himangana to copy on this. You've been extensively engaging with the pre-Paris sort of transparency rules. So what lessons do you think can we draw from this for the transition to the ETF?
Thank you so much. So sorry. Yes, thank you for this question about the existing arrangements. If it is about India, I might speak differently, but if it's about developing countries, then I would say that it is still at a life support system. And in my current position, like I deal with many students who are from different countries, and they're asked to study the national inventory systems in their countries and also the transparency arrangements in their countries. And some students come back to me saying that there is no data available, or the data is like 12-year-old from the national agencies. So I would say that in many countries, it is in a life support system, but then there are countries who have very high capacities. And I would just take it from my colleague from South Africa who mentioned that if you're asked to do it, you build the capacities and you keep getting better at it. So yes, we did build some capacities based on whatever we could actually do from the finances that was available. But South Africa has built a great national inventory management system, which I guess is a model that developing countries need to follow. In terms of India, that I would say the existing arrangement is more in a project mode. So the basic learning from that would be that if we really want to make it an annual inventory like we have in many developed countries, if we need that the data should flow smoothly from the industries, from different ministries, and basically from the data that we need to assess the key category sectors. So that should flow smoothly. And if that has to happen, we need to institutionalize. I'm sorry, I'm repeating something that I said in my first comment, that because we do not have a national inventory management system, it becomes a bit difficult to have a smoother inventory that comes even biennially. So now when we have the enhanced transparency framework, where we have not only the mitigation that we have to report, but also the adaptation that we have to report. So the problem is that for adaptation, you may not have as much data as you might have for mitigation, because the measurement indicators are not really available. And most of the data is qualitative and not quantitative. It cannot be for adaptation. So when you transition, it's very important that all the kinds of data is collected annually and then reported annually. So yes, so for the existing system, the learning is that we really need a legal framework for this. We need to institutionalize the transparency arrangements into the current legal frameworks. We need to set up a national inventory management system that can help to collect the data like regularly, but also to mention that enhanced transparency framework is not something that may just come in even 1 year. Next year, the BTR is due. So of course, we will continue to build our institutional and technical capacity. And as per the IPCC guidelines as well, it says that, you know, every time when you submit your inventory, you kind of improve yourself. And that's a part of the system. So, but yes, Sumit mentioned that it may not be a burden, but it's like an opportunity. So yes, transparency will help the developing countries to get more finance, because the funders will know what is your need. Unless you tell what is your need, you know, a baby cries and then gets food. So it's just like that. So we are really many countries in the developing world and the least developed countries, you know, the more the data they have for their own vulnerability, the more they will be able to pitch for adaptation and loss and damage finance in future. As I said, I talk about adaptation again and again because mitigation is not just something that might be relevant to developing countries, but also all these matters on adaptation. So, counting on the countries that they will come up with new data, the capacities will have to be developed, and unless those capacities are at a life support system, I believe that it is a burden to some extent. And the new transparency framework actually came up with many guidelines that, as compared to the earlier transparency framework that we had, it was a bit more than that. In half of those transparency arrangements, the burden has increased. In some of the transparency arrangements, the burden is higher on the developed country parts, especially when it comes to how much finance has been provided. That is something that is going to increase the burden on the developed countries, and it is good for the developing countries. As I said, that there are also benefits. So this game will be there, that the existing arrangements will have to be strengthened for the new transparency framework. And we do have capacities, we do have data, and there is definitely a possibility to 100% implement the new transparency framework. It's, for a country like India, it's definitely not a difficult thing. I'm sure that when these targets come up, all countries are part of the negotiations and they sign it when they know that they have the capacities to implement it. But this does not deny the fact that institutional capacities have to be developed for implementing the enhanced transparency framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Himangana, for those interventions. I think you touched upon many important points, like we also hear, the institutionalization of these systems, but also a little bit on the benefits, like accessing finance, that articulating needs in more detail, having quantified indicators for adaptation could help in that sense. I'm now going to pass on the floor to Reitumetse again to also comment on this question of what lessons can be drawn from earlier participation in transparency arrangement, and maybe also your view on this question of accessing finance with better data, if that's something you also see materializing.
So yeah, thank you, and I think really great insights and inputs. Again, just reflecting on my initial contribution, one of the big things that we can take from our previous, shall I call it, cycle on this transparency space, and Tapelo spoke a little bit to it. So an important thing has been the ability to connect and maintain some kind of a narrative of, what I'm doing at a company level, its relevance at a national level, and its, in some ways, recognition as you start to draw it into this international space as well. And so, that gives some degree of, I think, motivation, but also it contributes to a feeling of being part of the conversation and being part of the solution, which is something that I think we have leveraged quite well in South Africa. And I think kind of clarifying and tightening that going forward is something that will contribute to the ability of the country to report more transparently, but also to report, I think, more effectively, because underlying that reporting, and particularly the participation at a business level, are the kind of the requisite skills, the systems, as I said, the data at a level of granularity that makes it quite meaningful. On the finance perspective, I'd just like to reflect on some work that we've done quite recently, and that was in response to the next iteration of NDCs. And from the NBI's perspective, we wanted to make sure that business played a very important part in enhancing ambition. And we also wanted to make sure that that ambition and enhancing that ambition was based on sound, robust analysis. So that has been something that has been very important in mobilizing all the way from CEO level, but also to the practitioners and the people who are leading at an operational level, understanding what the opportunities are available for South Africa to transition and how to package that systematically and understand the finance needs. But a very important part of being able to do that and contribute to the national view of what could actually, what could enhance South Africa's ambition was the need to have very good data, information that people could have confidence in, and really aggregating it in a organized and systematic way such that we had that national view. And an important part of that, the basis of what we wanted to do was to make sure that as a country, we were able to transition in a managed, in a deliberate and a purposeful way, noting some of the challenges and the hard work that goes into transitioning. But having done that and really focusing on the robustness of the data that underpins the analysis and our view as a business community that not only must we transition, but how we can do it, was an input into a national process that then fed into some of the partnerships that we're seeing. And South Africa was one of the first country that participated in this Just Energy Transition Partnership. And the data that came out, being able to locate that business community as part of a national process, but also showing up globally, and really having the systems and the analysis to underpin that, contributed to our ability to then attract the kind of finance that we need to make this transition happen. And it's a continuous, it's a continuing conversation, but really we emphasized as part of how we came into that, being able to make fact-driven decisions, being able to, defend whatever analysis, whatever positions we put forward based on, very good data and the systems that underpin that, but linking it, as I said, to this national conversation that has helped us as a country then to show up on the global stage and be able to attract some investment for our own transition.
Thank you so much. And indeed, it's also worth to note that there's mandatory reporting as well for companies in South Africa on greenhouse gas inventories. And maybe linked to that, I'll give it to Tapelo to also build on this in your view, what lessons we can draw for the transition to the ETF, and maybe also responding on some of those remarks made about how much detail do we actually need and what's that going to deliver for South Africa.
Sure. No, thanks, Max, and thanks to my colleagues as well. I've jotted down here a few points in this regard, and for me, one that I think cannot be overstated is the fact that transparency or MRV or monitoring and evaluation within the climate space is not a by-the-way activity. It is not something you can do part-time. You have to be deliberate about it as a country if you want to be successful. I know of countries that have tried to develop domestic MRV systems for over 10 years, and they are nowhere near developing a good part or portion of the system, even just the GHG inventory system. They are still nowhere. So I think a country has to be deliberate, and this for me is a key lesson that I got. Countries have to be deliberate in MRV on transparency. And this is one of the success components, I think, of South Africa, in that when the country first established a climate change department, a climate change unit within the Department of Environmental Affairs, the teams were actually, there were actually 3 teams of equal size. There was an adaptation team, a mitigation team, and an MRV team, just as big. And at one time, because of the connections and the transparency processes that were happening, the MRV team was much bigger than the mitigation and the adaptation team on its own. That's because, as we have just said, collecting good, accurate, consistent data takes time, takes a lot of effort. It is not something you can do with someone doing it on a part-time level. And I think the other key component, for me that I've learned is that as a country, the national government does not have to do it alone. Business is here. Private sector is here. What is this? The civil society is here. And they are really happy, willing to help, and in many cases actually have the capacity. In many cases, the National Business Initiative in South Africa is actually contributing almost freely towards South Africa's transparency and other components, because many a time they actually have the resources to do it. So trying to do this by yourself is not a good, whether you actually have to legislate, because in some cases for us in South Africa, it had to be legislated to some extent through the National GHG reporting regulations and the carbon tax. And how was it regulated? Well, the GHG reporting regulations, which is aligned to carbon tax, required companies to report on tier 1 inventories only for 2 or 3 years. And they said from 3 years, you now report tier 2. Tier 3, and most of us understand what that means. It means they actually have to put in resources to now develop country-level emission factors or even facility-level emission factors, which you then just pull out as a country and you use for international reporting. The third thing here I've put down is that you need to constantly focus on capacity building. You need to ensure that you build capacity consistently, because whether it is the evolving MRV's requirements under the UNFCCC, which require you to keep learning and knowing, but also it is also the turnaround maybe of our staff turnover in different places. People who knew, then they have now gone to private sector, and your team is new and they know nothing. Keep training those and building capacity. And I also want to emphasize that some of these things like capacity building are not as expensive as we think they are in terms of the requirements. Of course, yes, you do need people, human beings there, which need funding to be there. But some of the capacity building activities can be as simple as peer-to-peer learning opportunities. You just approach, you are here, you meet the GHG inventory leader of the US. The US is quite good. She's a very nice lady, by the way. You just go and approach her and you say, hey, you know what? I want to give you a call with my team once every month, and I want you to just share with me how you do your GHG inventory in the USA. And that is simple. It's a team's activity, peer-to-peer. It costs 0 rands, dollars, pounds, nothing. And you can also do it with Japan. Maybe you say, well, the US does not really, they are probably more advanced because they have more staff. Well, Japan or the UK, for instance, has a different model, as you know, that it uses consultants as a sort of a permanent approach. You can say, well, maybe that's the approach you want to use permanently, and that's the one you do peer-to-peer with some of those. So I think we need to be innovative if you want to succeed in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Tapela. And there's some very interesting points. also the point about like, I really liked your point about the size of the team. Like we have this MRV team that's almost as large as the mitigation team. Aren't we doing a lot of monitoring then? But then you also mentioned it's also very key to the policies that we developed and implementing those. And now I'm turning to Sumit to briefly reflect, and then I'll open it up for comments.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I mean, I completely echo Tefelo on most of the points. Transparency reporting is not a part-time job. It cannot be. If you are, there are fundamental challenges that has been reported by the capacity building framework, third review of the capacity building framework with respect to transparency. It was told that most of the countries are doing this on an ad hoc basis, and domestically, countries face the challenge of capacity retention. That's another challenge, right? Data providers do not sync data in a manner in which, calendar year and a different year, financial year. So these are different fundamental issues with respect to, on transparency when it comes to implementing or reporting on climate actions and also taking it forward to UNFCCC submissions. There are various processes that, different ministries follow to be able to publish it internationally. So although if the report is being published, it takes about 3 to 4 months to get it reviewed domestically to be published internationally. These things are very hidden, and it doesn't really come out in that manner. And one of the most other fundamental challenge is the aspect of finance, right? What I've also heard from the experiences of the parties that the delay in getting the financial support also gets, the delay in the submission of the National Communication BOR. And that actually happens, the reason behind that is purely because we treat this as a part-time sort of a work, right? So the moment we talk about these part-time things, that's where, we lose we open this Pandora box of the challenges. So what is needed? The need is internalizing the climate reporting. The need is digitalizing the climate reporting. The need is to bring all stakeholders involved in this particular process, data providers, data analysts, everyone, and get them to understand that what we want to do it, what's the importance of it, and what it would lead to. That is the real need, and that's what would lead to a good climate reporting. That would give us briefly, very insights on the policy inputs, also on the progress of the NDCs, and so on and on. Right. On one last thing, which I wanted to sort of refer to, is the role of civil society in the transparency is huge, especially in the context of developing countries. Moving forward, when you talk about ETF, when you talk about those comprehensive greenhouse gas emissions, and also about the impact on adaptation as well as the loss and damages coming out. The role of civil society is immense here to give critical inputs to the governments on these components. We in India also have our independent greenhouse gas platform, which we report independently on the greenhouse gas emissions, apart from what the official submissions that Government of India does it. So there is a considerable scope for all the different parties to contribute to that particular space. And yeah, with this I can just conclude. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this. And indeed, a very interesting example you mentioned here, this greenhouse gas platform of civil society organizations who do a shadow greenhouse gas inventory report in this case. I would now like to open the floor for questions from the audience, but also panelists, feel free to raise your hand if you want to come in. I see a question there. Maybe we can have the microphone so that the virtual participants can also.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I would like to raise the question about, so my name is Magnus Ibon, I work at the Global Challenges Foundation, but I also have worked with looking at the connection with trade and carbon emissions. And one reflection there is that nations can control and report what is happening within their borders. So a country can have an accurate inventory of their domestic emissions, but there is also push towards looking at the inventories of what is the climate impact of the consumption in the country or the export, like the trade implications. And that is something that countries cannot do themselves, because you need to have then also data on trade and about emissions intensities in globally in different countries. And one thing that has struck me there is that those databases that we use when we look at that, they are like ad hoc projects driven by universities, perhaps with money from the European Union and some. So who can take responsibility to make sure that we have adequate information about, so we can make inventories of not only domestic emissions from production, but also how does the Swedish consumption-based emissions, we cannot do that, and those inventories are also very much lagging behind. We look at emissions that happened 5 years ago when we do those. So who should take responsibility for that?
Thank you so much for that question. Maybe we'll take one or two more questions from the floor, and then I'll get the panel to respond. Here in the front.
It's actually a comment for the panel, from what I've observed in this discussion on the need for transparency. I can see that most people are very much into like transparency and its relevance, especially from greenhouse gas inventory and all of that. But my name is Rawa. I'm from Ethiopia originally, and I've recently done a research on the role of transparency in LDC's context, especially in Ethiopia. And what my preliminary findings suggest is that it's actually very much a burden for countries like Ethiopia, because there is a huge divide between those few transparency practitioners and those who are actually working at the national level. There is a huge disconnect on that. So in Ethiopia, we have lots of domestic policies, but the issue isn't about reports or policies. We have plenty of policies, but how do we really translate that? And transparency, of course, we are producing some national communication reports in Ethiopia, but they're not being really integrated into national policy making. So I heard from one of the panelists from India that the baby needs to get the food, the baby needs to get to cry to get the food, but it's a good thing to say that, but to be honest, in the African context, really, even the transparency reports are not really being used by government officials. We do have other priorities on adaptation and loss and damage. So the question is like, what's the priority for developing countries like Ethiopia, who have really contributed less on greenhouse gas emissions? So I think we really need to question about the role of transparency reports. We do have lots of policies, domestic policies, and what's the added value of transparency in this aspect? So that's my comment. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that comment. Okay, we'll take one more comment from the floor and then also from our virtual participants. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot, Eva Löfbrand, Linköping University. Thanks a lot for a great panel. I just would be interested in hearing more about the possibilities of digitalizing reporting, as you suggested. Could you speak a bit more to what that would entail in practice? Sure. Thanks.
All right. Any question from our digital participants? Oh, okay. Not for this moment. So for the first question, can I give you the floor, Harro?
Yeah. Right, thanks, Magnus. So, as you know, the emissions reporting is territorial based, right? So there's no obligation for any government to report on their consumption-based emissions or extraction-based emissions, if you may. But that data is indeed available to some extent. I don't think there's anything stopping a country that is interested in doing so to report this type of data. Like, in the same way as almost like a shadow account of data. Whether they want to put that in their biannual transparency reports, that's another question. But I think it actually would be a good suggestion. And I think Sweden, you mentioned Sweden already, I think was actually starting to do that already domestically. So I think that would be a good development, but especially when we're talking about the context of developing countries, it would maybe create another burden of reporting more information. They already might be struggling to some extent to find out all of the territorial emissions, let alone also trying to figure out what the consumption-based emissions might be as well. So that would be my response to that. If I may just ask, like, throw one more thought out, and a question, if anyone wants to still answer this. We talked a lot about reporting throughout this side event, but we haven't talked, I think, at all about the review process. And I think the same questions about benefits and burdens also apply to that. Like, so to what extent are these processes, do they provide an opportunity for countries, or to what extent are they simply an obligation, a ritual that we need to go through, especially when it comes to the multilateral peer review process? So I would like to hear more thoughts on this as well.
Okay, I think various panelists are keen to respond by this point. Maybe I'll quickly go around. I think Himangana also wanted to respond online, is that correct? Yeah, maybe I'll first go to Himangana to respond online, and then I'll come back to the panel here in the room.
I will take 2 minutes. Sorry for the 2 questions. The first question on consumption emissions, I want to really answer that because I worked on it. In fact, I really thought that IPCC methodology was just focused on the production emissions because it doesn't really account for the consumption. In the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, which is from the 2008 to 2012, the Annex 1 countries increased their consumption by 10%. Although the production emissions decreased, there has been a heavy shift of the manufacturing industries from the developed countries to the developing countries, and that is why there was no global decrease in emissions. And this is a very important part of transparency, because if we are not doing this, this will continue to happen. We do not know how much consumption will be rising. Of course, now because we have developing countries as a part of the indices, in Kyoto Protocol, we didn't. So there was no transparency at all to see how this embodied emissions was actually impacting the global agenda. And also the role of the EIT parties, the economy in transition parties, they decreased their emissions almost 30%, the consumption emissions. So becoming friends with the EIT parties also means that your consumption-based emissions will decrease, even though you may actually be increasing your consumptions. So it's a very, very, very tricky game here when we talk about consumption. So I believe that yes, there should be a way to bring in the consumption emission aspect as a part of the transparency framework. And about the second question about the baby crime, it is totally agreeable that the countries that have contributed the least to climate change, obviously they do feel that adaptation and loss and damage is the most important for them, which is why I've been talking about it. However, it has been the most difficult to get finance for adaptation and loss and damage, which directly affects the communities. By the time you prepare the 200 pages report, the community is already in a phase of really in a shattering phase. So we do need that kind of vulnerability assessments and reporting and transparency even at the local level, so that it is easier for the communities to access the finance as fast as possible, whether it's related to adaptation or loss and damage. So I'm skipping mitigation here because I totally understand that the mitigation contribution is really low, and if you need to really develop, some of the countries might need to build some kind of sustainable pathways for that more transparently. But for adaptation as well, I still feel that until the baby cries, you're not getting the finance, so it's very, very important to come up with those strong reports in future so that it's easier to access the finance beyond words. Yeah, so that is my answer to both of those. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that very powerful response. We're now getting towards the end of the session, and I know there's still, I think, a lot of panelists who would like to respond to all this, but we have only a few minutes left. I think we're till 1 o'clock, right? So, yeah, so maybe I'll just, because Sumit, I see you're at the tip of your chair, I'll give you a small minute to respond, and then I'll give closing remarks to Aarti, and if there's any pressing, 1 minute for Harro as well. But you had your speech now as well. So Sumit gets a minute, and then Aarti for the final remarks.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, just on the digitalization bit, well, this comes from the fact that, the government of India is making a national inventory coordination system, which will bring all different players across India, be it data providers and everybody else, to just have that web-based platform and give inputs with respect to any activity data or emission factor in that portal itself. So what this happens is it minimizes the ease of information coordination, increases the coordination, everything else. So that's what we're talking about digitization, because right now what is happening is that we're looking into already existing data sources, which is basically at times manual entered, and there is a lag in the different time frames and so on and on. So that's where I was referring to the digitization. In terms of who should take the responsibility, very interesting question. I think the question should be why it hasn't come yet, right? Why? It's a political question, not really an answer to this, but if we want to include this in the reporting process, then it has to pass through the convention. Similar way that we have come with the ETF agreement, then we have to add another provision within the UNFCCC transparency framework to have that included, and I feel that would be very challenging at this particular moment on that note. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll now have to give it to Aarti for the final remarks, because we're almost at the closing.
Thank you very much. No, I think that this is perhaps, I mean, there's so many different things that could be said, but maybe this is a good one to pick up on, which is about, like Sumit was just saying, the question about consumption is a political question. We get into how feasible is it politically to do something about it. And I think that's the larger point here, right? What's the larger purpose of transparency? And is the design of the existing system a given? And that's the only way we can imagine it. I mean, there are larger questions of responsibility and accountability and equity, etc. The system could have been designed to shine the light somewhere else, but it hasn't been designed that way. And of course, we can say it's not politically feasible, but that is just something to note, that that has not been the choice. That is not where the light is shining, right, on things of that nature, the consumption side. And I think Himangana illustrated that point very well. So for me, the larger question is, what is the larger purpose of the transparency arrangements, and what are the political implications? And so I think is more always better on a very specific reporting front? Should everyone do it ever more frequently in ever greater detail? I mean, South Africa is a model example, of course, as we heard, but every country is not South Africa, right? And there have been many, South Africa has unique access to a lot of support for the transparency arrangements as well. And I mean, I think it's wonderful to have that possibility and to engage in that to that extent. But I think the larger question is, you know, what are these other priorities? How do they come to be realized as in the Ethiopian context as well? And if there's going to be a push to quantify these other elements like adaptation, loss and damage, what will that then do? Will the finance flow after you've engaged in an elaborate quantification process for these other priorities? The evidence is not necessarily there. The JET-P is very, very controversial, so whether the finance will flow there or not remains to be seen. So I think, yeah, I think that we can all hope, but together for transparency, as I have this thing hanging here, but we have to think about its political implications as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those final remarks, Aarti, and I think you summarized it very well. That leaves me to thank all the speakers and panelists for their valuable inputs. And in closing, just like to note that for those who be interested to continue the discussion, we're having another event on the 12th of December in a more interactive roundtable format at 1 o'clock in meeting room 36 for those who are still around on the 12th during the closing. Let's see when the closing is. You're very welcome to join those. And also, of course, for any further readings on transparency on the TRANSGOV website or the website from TRANSCLIM on the institutional website, there's various publications that we're happy to share if you walk up to us.